Ladies and gentlemen, this is Track Bro without my hat, and today we're going to be talking about the second part of the history of tuning. In this video, it is going to be the peak and the downfall. This is 2012 to 2020 plus, and basically, we're just going to go through some of the greatest cars that have ever existed in some of the categories that I think are worth mentioning. Quickly, let's just look at this beautiful collage that I made. Sorry guys, I really meant to make this video earlier, but I didn't have time. Here we have a Civic Type R, we have a Golf R, we got a STI, we got a this is actually an ISF. I believe there's like a GT version that has the wing. That's a GT 500. This right here is a GT12, a Vantage GT12R. My bad. Hold on. This right here is a Evo 10. I believe it's FQ 400 or something like that. I can tell because of the wing. This is a GT R. I don't think it's the black edition. I don't think it's the Pro. This is a RS5. This is a Nismo 2017 plus. This is a GTR. Oh, sorry, a GT3. That's an FRS, of course. This is a Z. I don't think it's yeah, it's not a non-Nismo. This is a CLS. That's a BMW M3 last gen and F80, I believe. This is the Genesis 1M, BMW 1M. It's a very good car. This is a Vauxhall or a Holden. I believe it's the Monero or the HSV. Sorry, the HSV something. That's a Hellcat, a refresh Hellcat. You can tell because of the hood. That is a ZL11LE, of course, TRX, Raptor, G-Wagon, and finally this is the FP700 F-150. So kind of here you could kind of see like some of the cars we're going to be talking about, what kind of cars they are, and what is their role. So firstly, let's talk about the influence of the mid-2000s going into the 2010s. Basically, at this time, sports compacts were selling like crazy. A lot of people, what was going on is the kids that kind of grew up with the 90s cars, they were growing up in an environment where they could afford a lot of really nice cars. There were a lot of options, and getting into high school and going into university or graduating from university gave you a lot of options, especially with loans. Loans were very, very cheap, even post 2011 plus. We were getting kind of like loans that were dropping at sub 1% values, so that allowed for car loans to be really, really cheap. What was the life cycle of a car usually nowadays, or at that time, was to finance it, then to have some warranty servicing done, then you'd have a modding season that happened right after the warranty came out or after the financing was done. Then you had a third rate reviews. So some cars were really, really good at financing and then going through the warranty, but not very good for modding. So that would be an example would be kind of like an RX-8. Really, really good car when you had the warranty, and then sucked ass when you no longer had the warranty and you had to modify it. Some of them went all through the modding season and then blew up. Those, we're kind of looking at the Mitsubishis, the Evos, and finally the really great cars lasted all three, all four evolutions, and got to the used dealer lot, and people got to use them. So some early 2000s examples were obviously Mitsubishis, BMWs, and obviously WX STIs. Those were pretty good at all four. Depending on which one, obviously some of them were trading different options, but if we look here, down here, we have the Camaro, the BMW 135i, and the Challenger. In the background, we have a Corvette. Those are really good examples of excellent cars that were kind of in the 2010 plus. Obviously SVT Cobra, these were really, really cheap. And also, back then, the Supras were still very cheap, early 2010s. Not many people knew about them. So that allowed for a lot of options. And really, at this point, internet culture was changing literally everything. For instance, journalism completely changed. Also, the car culture really changed because of in the internet. So, for instance, these are a lot of like modding cars that people really liked. Let's put it right here, and let's go through some of them. So, the BMWs became really, really popular, especially the 335i with the N54 engine, the twin turbos. they were really popular because they were easy to make chip tune builds. The Infiniti G35, G37, and the Nissan Zs were very popular as well back then. More so in the kind of like finance department because once you got them financed, they were much cheaper than the BMWs, and it allowed you for a lot of excellent mods that were not necessarily performance oriented, but let's say they were more performance to sustain. Versus with the BMWs, were kind of similar in that way, but they were quite more expensive, and also once you got a chip tune down, usually they were not super reliable. Also, it was really hard to find a good manual BMW versus with Infinitis, they were all mostly like grandma cars in the early 2010s, and then later on they became much more drift driven. So nowadays, like these are really good drift cars. People drift them around, although they crash them all the time. On the other side, you got the Americans. They had really good Mustang at this point. The 5.0 just came out. It was an excellent car. It was much cheaper than the other two. I mean, it was almost 328i price, and it was significantly more performance. So these were really cheap, budget 500 horsepower cars back then. WXSTIs and Evos really fought it out, and what was really winning was the WXSTIs. They lasted for a really long time. So around this time, 2001 era, WXSTIs were really cheap, versus some of the later ones were a little nicer than the Evos, and the Evos were kind of losing just in terms of price and performance. Although buying a Rally Art was a very budget friendly option. They were sub 20 grand at this point. And the Evo 10s, some of them, the MRs, were very cheap, and people didn't really realize that the GSRs were also like a budget king with a manual transmission. So they were kind of underrated compared to the WXSTIs, even though the STIs, the older ones like the 2006 here, were actually a very good budget deal. And regular WXs, the thing with them compared to the Rally Art was actually easier to make a bunch of power. But if you wanted a manual, you didn't have a choice to go to WX. Like for instance, in my case, I actually wanted a WX really badly coming out of high school, although I was kind of like later down the 2010s. Here, we have a GTI, so that was a really good option also if you wanted to finance, and they also made a bunch of power. These were the first like real pop tune or burble tune cars with the turbo force. Obviously, the BMWs nowadays, like you hear them crackle and stuff like that, but the very original like pop tune cars were really the GTIs. And then in the higher price ranges, if you were looking for something that was, of excellent bargain back then, GTR, you couldn't go wrong. They were very cheap back then. Supras, obviously, that's like a no-brainer. GT500s, they're a little bit more on the sweet spot for Americans. I mean, if you're talking about like 1,000 horsepower cars, obviously the GT500 was the easiest thing to do. It was really just a pulley and a tune away at this point, and we're talking about the 2012 plus, when they finally fixed all the problems with the new 5.8 engine that they had. And obviously the R8 V8 was also a really good option if you were looking for something more luxury, more exotic out of these four here. But yeah, this is really good. To get a good idea of what you had out there and what was like a smart buy back then. This is really what it was, and it was 100% like journalist approved. That's the thing that happened at this point, is that the internet was kind of kicking off. Many of the younger journalists that had a lot of influence, they started influences in inspiration from like previous generations. They got into it. They were really educated, and they knew what to talk about and when to talk about it. So it was really forums and YouTube galore. Sorry, just look at the pictures real quick. Yeah, this neon. So late 2000s, the forums were really the place to talk about builds. A lot of people were showing off their cars. There's a lot of good pictures, really high quality pictures were found on the forums, which brought a bunch of people in, and people loved to ask questions. And mechanics, because in their off time they really didn't have that much to do. And again, some of the better things that happened on the forums were also like sales. So it wasn't just pictures, but also people were selling stuff. The mechanics got onto the forums, and they gave a lot of tips to people how to build stuff, how to make stuff happen, and that allowed for a great boom in modding community, thanks to the internet, of course. So pictures, videos, guides were the big craze. Videos were, at first they were kind of popular on the forums, although later on, because there wasn't really any good way of showing off the video, like for instance, Flash was not a really good way of kind of uploading videos. YouTube really took over around 2007, 2010, and that really made a completely different, a completely different in the car community. I mean, we're talking people were going on the forums, watching the videos on YouTube, and then buying cars based off of those videos. And the videos also allowed for more content. You had quarter mile videos, drift videos, and so on and so forth. And this made it seem as though everyone was building cars. And so it created this mythology, this mythos. Everyone was building a car. And it was kind of in that way like how we feel about Need for Speed. You know, when you play Need for Speed, every car is tuned up. It was kind of that mentality, and kids growing up at this time, that's really what they thought the community was all about. And here, there's a couple of good examples here, like really popular cars. So this is a ZR1, but any supercharged C6 at that time was just an absolute quarter mile beast. CTSV, of course, an underdog car when they came out and destroying the quarter mile for a four-door car. Obviously, the BMWs were getting really popular with the turbo swaps, but also like the 335i's. The C63s are one of the most popular German cars that you could see online back then. The Silvias for the drifting, Evo 9s were really popular because of the 4G engines, but they were just killing it at the track with the all-wheel drive system, more so than the Eclipse even of prior years. And then you had Type R's and Neons. Those are like two examples of like sport compacts that people love to tune them up. And people just love to do whatever they wanted to their cars. Like these three examples are really popular. Obviously Supra, big turbo Supra, but some people, they were building RX-7s. You had V8 guys and rotary guys that came in a little later, but obviously the RX-7s, they were really really big. I would say mid 2010s, so like 2015ish. And the S2000s, I mean, stock form, they were great. And then once people stopped financing them, there wasn't really like a point to use the warranty. They were just like bulletproof, so people would start building them up pretty early on, I would say. Now we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which was the Honda Empire. So before this, Honda really didn't have, in the 80s, Honda really didn't have that much going for them. And now in the 2000s and 2010s, we're talking 20, 30 cars, sports cars, that were awesome to build with Honda. And this is a couple of examples. I don't want to go into all of them, but I really split them up into different categories. So on your top right here, you have your older cars. These are like the early 90s or late 80s cars that were really interesting to build. Really, the sweetheart here is probably the CRX. This is the one that everyone wanted. It was the most beautiful Honda they ever made, really. And people love to engine swap these because they were really, really cheap. Usually they were like grandma hand-me-down cars or daily drivers that were no longer useful. So people, they gutted them out and then they would put big engines in them. So they were really cool track cars, and they looked really good because they had that 80s look. Now, obviously, the most popular of the four what would you call that, squares, I guess, is the 90s Hondas, which I kind of already talked about. But really, like Civic Type R, Integra, Del Sol, these are really the ones that made it big on the internet because of how easy it was to put a turbo kit on and just make a bunch of boost. A lot of people, you had a lot of magazines that were actually like bankrupting around 2008, 2009. And so the companies that were actually selling like turbo kits and stuff like that, they had to get rid of them as quickly as possible to try to float themselves. And so that made turbo kits extremely cheap at this point. Not so much engine swaps at this point, but yeah, there was a lot of engine swaps that were kind of happening at the time as well when the turbo kits started like drying out, which is kind of interesting. Obviously the K20 boys. So this is all the 2010 plus cars. The only one that didn't have a K20 or 24 is this little Honda Fit right there, which I put in there really for shits and giggles, but girls really liked them. And later, like I would say like late 2015s plus, the Honda Fits, they figured out how to actually put K20s in them, so they became kind of popular in the track community a little bit. And then the darlings, the one that people dream about, not so much the Accord, but really the V6 Hondas, which are the ones that you don't even need to do anything to them. Manual V6 Accords are just awesome. And, obviously the S2000 NSX, these are the ones that people like put posters up, and then they own one of these three other squares, and that's kind of where they go with it. for the Honda empire. And they're still popular. They're still extremely popular, but they really shrunk in size how many cars they have on the used market that make a lot of sense. A lot of people at this time, they just got a Honda right out of the gate, and like right out of high school, let's say, and that was their daily driver for 10 plus years. Like a lot of the guys now, they're having kids, and they're giving their Hondas to as hand me downs to the kids, but the kids don't understand what it is. So these are getting rusted out, and they're not as popular as before. Like they were really really famous. Pretty much any car meet you went to, either in the show car parking lot or in the parking lot for the visitors, you always had Honda guys, and you'd hear them every night. The rise of the drift culture. So I kind of mentioned this a little bit. Really, what happened was in the 2000s, like early 2000s, when people were getting into the Japanese cars, one of the big media figures was the Drift King DK Tsuchiya, and then past that in 2006 when they had Tokyo Drift, a lot of kids started getting into drifting quite a lot, and especially teens in high school. So there was a huge community of drifters in Japan, in California, and it started really getting popular in the Midwest, in the South, and so on and so forth. So there was a bunch of good cars for drifting. Here's a couple of them. I don't want to mention too much because I kind of mentioned them, but the Silvias, any Gen Silvia, any version 886. Some people like MR2s, first gen MR2s. Obviously the Z's are really popular now, but you even have like obviously BMW E46, E36. The FRSs are getting kind of popular because of the engine swaps. They were kind of gutless before, but now they're good, and so on and so forth. Obviously, people use like even Corvettes nowadays because they're cheap, but it was just awesome to see that the drift culture went from something that was kind of niche, cool in a video, and now there's a whole competition called the Formula Drift, and people join all the time. And also, there's localities now, which is cool. So it's kind of like if track racing made itself into kind of like an art. That's kind of what you get, and it's also a demonstration of the acceleration of car culture, the real like explosion, because we're talking about cars that are no longer just going fast. They just look pretty, and this kind of puts off some purists. I think it's kind of cool, but I don't think it goes that. I think it kind of goes a little too far when we're talking about cars that have like steering angle mods and has fat tires, or they have really weird body kits, and it kind of gives you that vibe of like this is really cool for younger kids to get into the sport or get into cars, but then you can't really do anything with those cars. So I don't know what to think of it too much, but I do know that it's an art form and people love to watch this stuff. But yeah, it completely loses the motorsport appeal. This idea of like the athlete, the car athlete, maybe you could consider them athletes, but again, they're really artists. That's really the way you should look at it. And there was a serious wave of Euro car supremacy that also happened at this time. This is kind of like mid 2000s up, but it really like they started dominating really 2010 plus. There was no such thing as a Euro car supremacy before this. And what I really am talking about is a lot of like a bunch of European cars that were surprisingly well tunable. So in the past, Euro cars were usually luxury or a little sporty or a little supercar-y. There wasn't that much in the mix otherwise, but most of them were not exactly competitive, let's say, with the American cars in that way. They were competitive in the daily ability with the car, or the let's say the suspension, or the luxury of the car. However, in this time, because the Americans and the Japanese started building performance cars, the Europeans finally decided to join the race. They started, kind of becoming a little bit more crazy. And these are some of the really cool engines we got. So the N54 was a really popular one. It's twin turbo inline four by BMW. All of the S series BMW engines. So this is all the what would you call them? The exotic or motorsport M series engines were really awesome, but were not exactly as tunable as the N54. The N54 is kind of like the bread and butter of any BMW tuner. Then the Mercedes. So Mercedes kind of kicked it off a little bit in early 2000s with the M113K, which is the compressor, the supercharged version of their V8, the 5.5 liter, and then also the M156, which is also a really awesome engine that made it in like the best engines of all time. And also Audi has been kind of in and out of the race, with a bunch of cool engines, most notably the Audi modulars. So that's the 4.2 V8 40 valve, which is really popular. With the S4 manual, loud V8, 5 valve per cylinder, which is really cool, and all-wheel drive. Later on, we had the 4.0 twin turbo, which is really like a modern beast that we can get in a lot of cars now. But also Audi kind of was like early, a little too early in the game, but really cool that they had the 2.7 twin turbo, which started really making the 600s and 700 horsepower cars into the Audi wagon that you see right there. And the 3.0 TT is also a pretty good engine, but obviously like TTRS engine, or the RS3 engine, that's a really good one that came out only a couple of years ago. So Audi kind of has like that kind of like underbelly, let's say, performance. Volkswagen kind of taking like the lead with that, with the EAE, of course, the Golf R engine. So really what the European cars give you is incredible amount of options, and I'll show you that a little later, but for a premium price. And that kind of puts off a lot of like younger buyers, or a lot of people that are kind of they don't have the money for it. But if you have the money for it, the Euros is a way to go. Now, one of the first engines making 1,000 horsepower for the Europeans is, of course, the N54. Audi maybe a little bit, but really the N54 is the one that you should probably be thinking about. It's the one that makes 1,000 horsepower really easily. It's the B58's older brother. Another engine that you should consider also is like in the exotic field, kind of, is the Mensker engine, but also the Mensker engine, which is the Porsche engine of like the 996 and 997. The twin turbo version, or if you put a twin turbo kit on it or whatnot, they make a bunch of power, and they're like good for like 800 plus horsepower. Really cool car, but not as popular, of course, as N54 and the Audis and so on. So really, with the rise of YouTube, we started getting the drag strip videos and also the Mexico videos. So in Mexico, that's like an expression. It really just means like that they're kind of racing on the highway. But yeah, like you're getting a lot of like at this stage, you're getting a lot of like what they call the 1320 videos, or like the drag strip videos. 1320 is like the feats, and you get these really cool videos that surprise people a lot. So here's a couple of them. You had Golf R's that were absolutely dominating the track. I mean, at first they were R32s, but then afterwards, Golf R was a little bit better to make a bunch of boost. Against like Supras, let's say, like 1,000 horsepower Supras were losing. You had, obviously, like, I've even seen like V8 swapped Civics, but usually they were like K20 turbo swaps, or like nitrous K20s. Those were pretty awesome, and usually because they're like wide, they have really big tires in the front. Obviously, you had the muscles, like the older muscle cars, so the 4th gen Camaro and the SVT Cobra. Those were really popular in the quarter mile videos, especially early on. WX STIs, the chip tune STIs, the turbo STIs, Evos, pretty much the same thing. Against Gallardos, against supercars, that was like a really popular type of video. It's just like against a supercar, like a compact car against a supercar. GTRs were also very dominant. That's like the very first cars that were doing 3 seconds 0 to 60. So, out of all of them, this is probably the one that survived the longest in terms of like drag records. But all of these were like really cool because it created this kind of like underdog idea, and also it allowed kids to feel as though like they're buying a budget car, but actually they could beat like whatever they want. Gave you that idea of like this greater sense of creation and modability. And I do also want to mention the freaking Volkswagen Rabbit. This is like one of the first videos I've ever seen. It was like a 2,000 horsepower Volkswagen Rabbit against a Bugatti, and on paper the Rabbit was destroying it like very easily because it had the EAE Golf engine. So yeah, like these were like internet icons, just like the legends, and they were really creating new records of power, and this was pushing the envelope on the modding community, what to do to your car. Now, like a really later, like much later, was the V8 swapped Miatas, which were beating also supercars. But again, like all of these were like ideas in your head that allowed you to kind of get into the sports car community because you had the mythology. So that's pretty cool. Obviously, the engine swap culture that was going in full force later, like a couple years ago, and it's really just drift cars. Like when they started realizing, okay, we need more drift cars. It's easier to just put a V8 in a Sylvia than, let's say, buying a Corvette or something like that. It was cheaper most of the time. So what people did is exactly that. They would swap their engines, and people just started doing that specifically for drag and drift. So V8 Miata is probably one of the first ones. People realizing, tiny Miatas, big Corvette engines. I mean, relatively big, compact Corvette engines, and those were really, really the first ones. But then you would get, like, for instance, like right here we. Oh, sorry. Oh, this way. Right here we have SVT Cobra with a 5.0 turbo engine, so that's a pretty popular one now. MRSs were pretty popular. Like Lotus, you could think like Lotus or MR2 MRSs. Got K20 swaps, that was pretty popular. K20 swap Civics, those were really early on as well. V8 swap Sylvias, of course. And then later on, we got some of the more like exotic options, like the WX STI with like a V8 sometimes, or like a rotary. Those are like much later on. But I remember WX with STI swaps, those were really, really popular. Like even like mid 2000s, very popular, like JDM swap to do. And of course, like you also had non-swaps that had like tranny swaps, for instance, like the SC300. So the SC300 came with a 2JZ, but everything else was crap in the car. So what people would do is they would put the either a TR or a Tremec transmission, or they would put a the super transmission. That was also doable in the early time for engine swaps when they were really cheap. But yeah, it was really just K24, B16, B18, LSX, small block Chevy in some cases, rare cases, 2JZ, and sometimes you would get RB. Like RB was really not really an American thing, but yeah, very popular. So our media was really crazy. So this is like 2010 YouTube up on top here, and we got a lot of journalists. I was saying that, but also we got a lot of DVD videos. We got a lot of video games. Around this time, like Fast and Furious 2009 was also kicking it off, kind of bringing back the old characters, and that brought like more kids into it. But yeah, the big thing was the journalists that we got, the internet journalists. So Camissa, uh, that dude in blue. I forget the other guy. Smoking Tire podcast, of course. But back then it was The Drive. The Drive was really popular, and we also got like TV personalities, or we got like supercar personalities, thanks to like some documentaries that happened. So one of them is, of course, the Hennessy John Hennessy. That's Supercar Daily or Exotics Daily. I forget his name. And really surprisingly, we also got Jay Leno make his own TV series on Crackle, and also on like cable TV PBS. But then they also converted it to YouTube. Everything went to YouTube around this time. But yeah, what really like brought me into it was that dude in blue, Camissa on back then he was with Car and Driver, making a bunch of good reviews, and the Smoking Tire, they used to make The Drive, which was incredible show, with the Corvette challenges and so on and so forth. Those are really, really good, and it was just awesome to watch, right? Then we gotta mention also Top Gear. So Top Gear is probably any kid's favorite. It was pretty much like a family car show. They had a bunch of DVDs that was really cool. You could get any DVD at Walmart, and they were really, really cheap. So that got you like a bunch of content that you could just watch if you're really, really poor. Netflix ended up getting Top Gear, so that made them very popular in like 2011, 2013. And of course, like the main thing that made them popular was the three comedians. They were really, really funny. They knew a lot about cars, a lot more than like the average kid, let's say, and that allowed for kids to get into it, but also it allowed adults to kind of like enjoy looking at cars and understanding like what's going on with them. So I think that was pretty cool. Also, some of their like used videos where they're like showing off used cars and like road trips. That was a real inspiration to a lot of us. Like, oh crap, we could actually do this kind of stuff. And I ended up doing that. So I ended up doing a road trip with my own used car that I liked. So that was pretty cool. A push in the right direction as well was the special trims that were coming out at this time. So no longer did we just have cool sports cars, but now we also had cool sports cars with a special trim. So here's a couple of them I wanted to mention. So let's go left to right. Here, that's a Z28 with a 7 liter 7, very cool. This is a XKR S GT with a wing. This one had pretty trick suspension from what I remember, and it had the 5-liter supercharged V8 that Jags have, and they're just awesome engines. Like nowadays, you could easily get one for pretty cheap, and really cool car, the XKRs. Um, Obviously, Boss 302 Laguna Seca edition, so that's a special edition of a special edition, pretty much unheard of. And the introduction of the Hellcats, obviously, that's something we got to talk about a little later on, but they were really, really cool when they came out. Especially the original Hellcat, it was just incredible that we're getting finally 700 horsepower out of a car. BMW M2, M3, and M4 comps, those were pretty cool. Obviously, the C63, that's a that's a 507 edition, so it had a little bit more horsepower thanks to, I think it had like a trick intake, and obviously the black edition, but that's just another story because they started off much longer before. The STI Type RA, the S209, S208, those ones we finally got here in Canada and in the States. And we also got La Chute Performance, so La Chute Performance, so this is like a special tuning company in Canada that we're really proud of. They made 400 horsepower WX STIs, early 2008, and then going onwards. Like I think they even had one like a couple of years ago. Obviously the Vipers were really cool, but the nicest Viper was the ACRs. Those ones were killing it at the track at the time. The Evo 10 FQ400. We never got the FQ400, but we got the bumpers, and we really liked the look of it, which allowed us to kind of want the Evo a little bit more. And finally, this is a Corvette Z06 Carbon Edition that was actually sold by George Bush Foundation, so that's pretty cool. And obviously there's so many Corvettes that are special edition, but at this time they weren't just special edition, they were actually making more power, so that's really, really cool back then. Then we got the Tesla effect, so around 2014-ish, Tesla was kind of saying they were going to make a performance version of their electric cars, and at first everyone was scoffing. There was no such thing as an electric car pre-2010s, and Tesla kind of came out of the blue. Elon Musk decided, okay, maybe we should make some sort of like publicity stunt by making really fast Teslas, and I've pretty much always been on the gas car side. Because I always thought it was like, I already knew it was like a publicity stunt, and it didn't really show off that much that I was interested in. But the Tesla effect was that people loved it or hated it and got into cars because of that, like how quarter mile works, how other cars compete, and so on and so forth. And so actually Tesla helped the car community in this way, and so I'm very grateful in that way. So here are a couple of really interesting ones that came out. In 2015 was the P85D. Which was really the first edition that had like a lot of power. I don't know why it was called D, but that's what it was. And that one made between, like, a lot of the journalists were saying 11, like mid to low 11 seconds, but actually they were doing like 11.2 to 11.6 ish, and it was actually pretty interesting. For an electric car, people were kind of surprised, like, man, it's actually surprisingly fast. Wasn't as fast as some other competitions. So, for instance, the Mercedes E63 that came out maybe 2-3 years before that was doing 11.5-ish, and with a tune made quite a bit more. But obviously, out the factory, that's kind of impressive for a brand new electric car. Well, wasn't brand new, but then in 2016 they hit it off with the P90D Ludicrous. Now this one was not just something that was fast, but it was ridiculously fast. At the time, 10.9, I mean, that beat most supercars of not even 10 years before. So that was really impressive. But at this time, if you're looking at like a sedan, the Hellcat, the Charger Hellcat came out about 2-3 months afterwards. And we weren't quite sure what it was, but we thought it was retaliation. Dodge said, no, you guys are not going to take it from us. We're going to beat you to it. And so they made a Hellcat, Charger Hellcat that made between 10.8 and 11 seconds. So they were kind of beating, like on average, beating the P90D or slightly slower, depending on when or where. But it was really cool that we finally got some competition out of them. And in 2017, we got the P100D Ludicrous, which got a bigger battery, and they were trying to test out a little bit faster speeds. This is the one that had like 800 plus horsepower, which was really cool. And it was on paper doing 10.5 seconds, so that was really impressive. But then a little bit earlier that year, we got the M5 competition, which is still one of the fastest cars around the Nurburgring, one of the fastest sedans around the Nurburgring, and that one did a mid 10 seconds with a quick chip tune. Now, just so you know, at this point, like, we kind of have to cheat with the gas cars because the electric cars were, they get to cheat. Like, they could do whatever they want with the car. They could even rip off the tires if they wanted to, and that doesn't really ruin any EPA laws. Versus with the gas cars, they have to abide by these laws, which, makes them really unfair advantage onto Tesla in this case. So that's why I say chiptune. And then finally, in 2021, they finally released the Plaid Edition, which is like the wide body, really really fast version that they had, and they were trying to make it for quite a while. It took them a while to kind of get the specifics down, but when they did come out with it, it actually beat a bunch of records for electric cars. And however, the Dodge Charger Hellcat with some pretty simple mods could do already like sub nines pretty easily. I mean, some of them do like twin turbo swaps, which will give you like less than 8 seconds. But it was just really cool to see the Plaid Edition to get some competition, and obviously there wasn't that many things that are faster than a Plaid Edition, so that was kind of cool. So now we got to talk about what really sucks. Why I think, like, one of the reasons why I wanted to make the presentation in the first place. The gas industry is failing on us, and we may not have sports cars in the near future, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Now, I don't want to get political on this channel, but this is just something that is 100% something we have to talk about, is that politics are ruining car culture. A lot of people believe truly in their hearts that the reason why gas cars have to go is because the gas cars are not good for the environment. And I'm here to tell you that that is a complete lie. That is a top-down lie. That is literally a lie by our political leaders that want to basically suppress your economic prosperity. That's pretty much what it is. A really good example is back in the day, they used to say that the Volkswagen Beetle was actually quite good for the environment. Anti-smog laws allowed for made such that American cars, which were generally bigger than European cars, could no longer be on the road because of the smog that they caused. And yet nowadays, so we have this imagination in our heads that the Volkswagen Beetle is actually a very good for the environment car. It's a small car, so automatically it has to be good for the environment. I grew up on these rules, right? And nowadays we look at modern day Volkswagens, which are infinitely times better for the environment and much better for the emissions. And because they quote unquote cheated on the emissions test, I'm not going to get into the details, but basically they didn't cheat. They basically used the rules against the EPA, and then they got mad. But because of that, we have this impression that actually these cars are really, really bad for the environment. Now, let me give you a quick comparison, okay? Here we have a Corvette, and here we have a horse. Can you please tell me which of these two, by year, produces more CO2 in the atmosphere? That's right. The horse produces about 1.2 times more emissions than a Corvette. So to kind of believe that Volkswagens, the diesels even, are somehow worse than a Corvette, I no, this is not the truth. What it is it's a political lie to try to control what you get to buy. So this causes a lot of problems. It causes economic problems, for instance. So right now, the average entry-level car takes about 6 months of your paycheck to actually buy. This is a new car. And the thing is that back in the day, a Volkswagen Beetle was only a week's worth of salary to actually buy. So that's kind of a way you could look at it. The reason why you can't buy a Volkswagen Beetle today is because safety and emission standards killing off the Volkswagen Beetle. When in reality, if these politicians were actually serious about helping out the individual man, what they would do is they would try to build a new Volkswagen Beetle. Except that's exactly that is the opposite that they want. What they want is they want you not to be able to afford the Volkswagen Beetle, such that they can afford the infrastructure that is correlated with cars, which is obviously gas, roads, and other infrastructure, including like traffic. All of these all of these specific infrastructures are very very expensive to afford and causes a large a budget strain on governments. So by relieving people from driving cars, of course you don't want to drive a car. Why do you want to drive a car? It's bad for the environment. It actually benefits the government such that they can no longer provide those services for you, the infrastructure, which should be a core service that the government provides. That's really like the basics of it. I don't want to get into it more than that, but economically speaking, that is exactly what they want you to do. They want to discourage you to buy a car so that they can afford the infrastructure we already have. When in reality, what they should do is they should provide better infrastructure such that you can actually be more prosperous. You could actually go to work and live your life the way you want to live it. And the problem is that with all these policies, the safety, emissions, and so on and so forth, the car companies have to invest more and more money into the car community or the car industry to actually make a profit. Because every time you have a new safety standard, you gotta research the safety standard, figure out a way to combat it or actually like abide by it, and this way, the car company can finally make some profit. So our sports cars are going to be sacrificed in the process because again, any car costs a couple $1 billion to actually produce, to research and develop, and if the sports cars, which are very low volume cars usually because you can't have that many based off the emissions test, based off the safety and so on and so forth. This means that we're gonna have less sports cars in the future, and car companies can't do anything about it because again the government gets all the control. And for instance, like the Volkswagen fiasco that happened a couple years ago with the diesel emissions is a direct violation of the rights of a company. The company is allowed to produce any kind of vehicle, and based off the emissions test, they did pass. So to reconsider the emissions test and say no, you cheated with a bullshit stipulation. Sorry for my language, but is it's an overstep of what the government can do to companies. And I know this happened in Europe, but again, this is government abiding by European rules. This is unacceptable as well because again, the U.S. and Canada were nations. We're not supposed to abide by other nations' standards, especially if it's already pushing the boundaries of what our constitutions allow. So the real net outcome of these overbearing governments is that car companies are actually dying. Now, at first glance, when I first looked at this graph when I was a kid, seeing that 14 car companies control the combined 54 brands, in my head I said, okay, well, that's because the brands are monopolizing. They're actually producing the same amount of cars, but they're getting together so that they can make more profit off the cars. That is not true. Most of these car brands have been trying to survive over the government regulations that were put onto them. And they have been doing, most of them have been doing a terrible job. So a really good example is Chrysler. So in this graph here we have FCA. Actually, FCA got bought by one of the companies here. I think it's, anyway, one of the companies here, I forget what it's called. But again, Stellantis, which is like a merge of FCA and a couple of the companies here. I think PSA and so on and so forth. Really just a European merge. And another example is Daimler, which is merging with I don't remember one of the other companies, Nissan with Renault, and so on and so forth. All of these companies, they used to be bigger and they used to own more brands and they used to make more cars per company. But what happened was, to try to survive, they had to merge together, and merging costs money. So the fact that they even had to do that is ridiculous. It's a direct proof that the car industry is worsening and not getting better. So now let's look at some of the solutions that we have so far, and what are the solutions in the future. So I think the first thing I'd like to talk about is basically we don't have a choice anymore. It's at the point where we don't have a choice. We have to evade the gas engine regulation because it's going too far. They want to remove gas engines by 2035, and they want to do this industry-wide. And this isn't an acceptable proposition, but if we want to continue owning our sports cars, we have to find solutions. So here are a couple of solutions that the market has created. here we have the super SUVs. So the super SUVs, like this Cayenne GT, Turbo GT, and this SVR, they're really just SUV platforms, truck platforms that have trick suspension, really big brakes, and really big engines, and they get kind of the same fun as other cars, like for instance, the M5 Comp here. And so they are pretty cool because they give you a large range of performance, a large range of utility, and a large range of vehicular activities. And so in that way, they're real SUVs, I would say, finally. But they're pretty cool in that way. We also get really nice trucks. So trucks get to evade the regulation because they're made for towing, made for industries, businesses that are non-regulated by the government just yet. I mean, eventually they will be. So you get cool trucks like the TRX and the Raptor, and we might be getting a GMC one pretty soon, or Chevrolet one. So that's another way to evade the market. You just buy a truck, and you get kind of the same performance and the same exotic engine. Another way is to buy older cars and to chip tune, actually mod them. Obviously, they can't really do anything because it's your own property. Up until now. And finally, you also have kit cars. So these are kind of two kinds of kit cars. So in Britain, they've been having this problem for quite a while, actually, in other ways, regulation specifically. So they've been having kit cars for a very, very long time. And they have like Caterham, Lotus, and Noble, and so on and so forth. Companies that have been making kit cars for a really long time. So in that way, maybe the British might grow back some of their economy that they lost over the last 50, 70 years. But again, we have really good ones like Factory 5 Racing and so on and so forth. Those companies will definitely be growing in the near future because they have a market that the government cannot regulate at all. Now, you have to understand, like, in real time, this is killing our time preference. What is time preference? Well, basically, it's killing our opportunity to purchase a car. If it takes 6 months instead of 1 week to afford a car, then imagine when you have to buy a bigger car or something that is more exotic that gives you the same kind of opportunity of sportingness in your car. Well, that's going to kill your time preference because you're going to be saving up for this car instead of something else. So the trucks here, the SUVs, they're very, very expensive to buy. They're like 150,000 plus for like the sportiest version. And it's not the car company's fault. They're not really even making that much money off of them. It's more so the government's fault because they're putting large taxes on these companies and to quote unquote create green technology. So in a matter of years, we're going to see sports car enthusiasts getting very angry, very sad, very depressed because they cannot buy their cars because the government said so. So, in my opinion, politics should never mix with economic needs. Now, an economic need is not like, for instance, oh, I need water. No, an economic need is the idea that the customer is always right. I believe I need something, and so I'm willing to pay for whatever I need. But the problem is that the politics get in the way of that, in the way that when the politics decide how much something should be. So, for instance, I want a luxury watch, okay? Now, let's say the government thinks that that's stupid, or they think that they want to use your money for something else. So what the government will do is they will tax the watch company such that I can no longer actually purchase it. So who does that benefit? It doesn't benefit me, and it doesn't benefit the watchmaker. So who does it benefit? It only benefits the government because now the government has that money in their pockets. So that is actually very, very bad because both me and the watchmaker, which are supposed to be citizens of the nation, are losing out by the nation. So it's clear as day that this is just autocracy and like borderline communism, which is unacceptable. So what I think should happen is to start make a difference, to try to get involved into politics, to show off that in fact we are people too, that we deserve representation, and we don't deserve this kind of garbage thrown our way. If we want cars, we should have cars. If we want gas cars, we should have gas cars. It has nothing to do with this quote unquote green technology and these safety standards. These are just excuses to try to make you lose your actual dollar. And so never listen to this kind of propaganda, right? Like if you think about it this way, between you driving a big TRX truck and let's say a Peterbilt who is also driving a big Caterpillar truck, who do you think is using more gas? Clearly the Caterpillar. Now, why do you think that they don't get any tax, or they get very low taxes, and yet you get all the taxes? You have to pay for a much more expensive car. It's very clear. It's because you did not have a proper political voice at that time, at the time that you got taxed. So we have to try to organize and try to figure out how to uh, really make a difference in the politics, such that the politics no longer matters, so that we could go back to the good old days, the good BMWs and so on and so forth. All these cars we're going to be missing out on because guess what? We didn't organize properly. So I want you to know that, thank you so much for watching this video. And I think that the main thing you should get your head around is we had a really good history, very, very good history in the last 20 years, and we need to make a difference. We need to bring it back. We need to make sure that it keeps going, because this is something that affects all of us. If you're part of this hobby, if you love cars, guess what? Your kids, your grandchildren, are not going to be able to be a part of it, and that's going to be very, very sad. So make sure to make a difference. And another way that you can make a difference is just get into bikes because bikes get a lot less of this rap. They get a lot less of this bad rap, and they're actually much easier to get into in terms of like price point, and they're almost as much fun. It's sometimes even more fun, I would say, than most cars. So that's maybe a possibility for you. But stay in there and try to enjoy what we have now. And in the near future, I think we will come back. And yeah, I made this huge collage for you guys. I kind of wanted to show it off a little bit. So we got obviously a demon right here, and here we got a ZL1. It's actually a Exorcist. Here we got a Blackwing, the ZR1. Now the new ZR1 just came out, but I think this one's way more badass with a 7-speed. Here there's a Viper ACR. This is a SVT Cobra. This is a obviously GT350, STI Evo 10. Type R S2000. Actually, that's the Maui attack version from Drift King videos. Here you got a cool carbon fiber GTR, and down here we got a Del Sol and a Silvia, Miata, Supra, MR2, RX-7. That's a Radical. That's a Lotus. Now we're getting into the exotics here. That's an Aston Martin Vantage S with the V12, I believe. This is a Alfa Romeo 4C, McLaren 650S, because that's the really like the epitome one, the one that people wanted for a really long time. I know the 720S is cooler, obviously. This is the again XKRS GT, really cool car. This is actually a 599 non-Evo, but the non-GTO, but the GTO is the cooler one of the two. That's a Huracan. It's just a. I just said it's an Evo Spider. This is a 458 Italia, because I think that's the epitome of the exotics that came out pretty recently. This is a R8. That's right here. That's a Cayman GT4. These two, that's a 997 GT2 and a 996 GT3 RS. That's the first RS that we got. That's a Maserati Gran Turismo S, I believe. This is a SL65 Black Edition. The Black Editions. I didn't even talk about them, but they're really cool. Bentley Super Sport right here. That's an M5 Comp. The same picture as earlier. This is a RS5. That's a CLS. That's a RS6 GT, because it's the ultimate version of the wagons, the Audi wagons, which are really cool. That's an M2 Comp. Now here we got an AMG GTR Pro, but obviously the GTR Black Edition is a little cooler. On top here we got a C63 Black and a M3 GTS. Those are pretty nice. That's a Boxster Spider, a C63 Coupe, which I put there because I didn't know any other Mercedes that I really like nowadays. And on top here, kind of correlated to the Corvette, is the Z4M Coupe. And then finally, for the epitome of the Germans cars, that's the German corner right here. Even though there's a bunch of Germans here, but this is the 911 Speedster, and that really makes the whole list here. You could tell, like, over here you got more of the budget cars, the epitome of the budget cars. Down here it starts to get kind of annoying. There's a lot of more variety, but again, can't really see that much, and there's not really one that kind of iconizes them. And then the more you get into the German stuff, the more it's variety. The more you get into the European as well, variety, but a lot more expensive. Like this is, that demon right there is half the price of actually the 458, and then I think a quarter of the price of the Speedster. So it's kind of interesting that way. Anyway, I tried to summarize the last 10 years of cars, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Have a great day.